and we'll make the recording link available to you in a day or two. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jill with the Arch National Respite Network and Resource Center, and thank you all so much for joining the Lifespan Respite Grantee and Partner webinar today. As always, we want to encourage lively and engaged Q&A and discussion later in the call after our presenters. So we are going to leave you all unmuted on on our end. But while our speaker's talking, please mute your phone, and you can do that by hitting *6. I think just in the interest of time, we will not do formal introductions today. If you didn't sign in to Adobe Connect with your name, because we're seeing just some phone numbers up there instead of names, please type your name in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and then we'll know who was able to join us today. Later on when we do Q&A, just unmute yourself by hitting *6 again, or your own mute button on the phone. And please don't forget to let us know what state you're from before you speak. As usual, I also just have a few quick announcements. I want to remind everyone that registration is now open for the National Lifespan Respite Conference. That is scheduled for next May, and we're hosting that in collaboration with the New York State Caregiving and Respite Coalition and the New York State Office for the Aging. And as always, we're very grateful for their help and support. I did want to remind you, though, that in addition to registering for the conference, I would strongly encourage you to go ahead and reserve your hotel room as soon as possible. If it turns out that you're not able to attend, you can cancel, I believe, a day or two before the conference date without incurring a penalty. We have a limited number of rooms in the discounted room block.
Turn that down because you're probably going to hear jabber from both, you know what I'm saying?
I would ask everyone again, because we're not muting you from our end, please make sure your phones are muted until you want to have a chance to speak. So there are limited rooms in the conference block, and we make them available on a first-come, first-served basis. So while it may say the room block is available until March 1st or March 15th, very well, most likely will sell out way before that date. So to be safe, please just go ahead and reserve your rooms. I also wanted to just give you a heads up that the name of the hotel will be changing from the Adams Mark to the Buffalo Grand. And I don't want anybody to be alarmed. We're not changing the venue. The hotel is just changing the name. So just a heads up with that. I also wanted to let you know that we just added 2 events to our calendar because we were able to identify some really excellent presentations that we didn't really want to delay. The first one is a webinar that we're going to hold on December 6th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. And the topic is on home care cooperatives. And this has really been emerging as a promising strategy to address the direct care and respite provider shortage, especially in rural areas. And home care cooperatives are worker-owned cooperatives. That is, the home care aides own and manage and govern the business. And it's demonstrating some very interesting success stories in certain parts of the country. And we have a wonderful presenter who was actually the founder of the first such cooperative in Wisconsin almost 2 decades ago. And her name is Margaret Bow, and she's with the cooperative. She is a cooperative development specialist at USDA Rural Development in Wisconsin. I recently heard her speak on this topic, and it was a very engaging presentation, and I think may have some interesting ideas for all of you that are struggling, especially with respite in rural areas and struggling with the respite provider shortage. I also wanted to mention that the Sustainability Learning Collaborative is going to host a webinar on January 23rd at 3 p.m. We've been fortunate enough to secure Marissa Scala-Foley, who's the director of the Aging and Disability Business Institute, at the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging. She's very graciously agreed to talk with us about how to engage managed care organizations in providing or supporting respite. And she's also just going to share all the wonderful resources and technical assistance they have available through the Institute to help you all develop some business acumen. And I'm fairly certain even though it's a sustainability learning collaborative call, because of the topic I think will be of interest to everyone, we may open it up to all of you. And then finally, I just wanted to remind members of the ACL Arch Data Collection Work Group that we're scheduled to meet on January 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern to continue to hear from work group members about their own performance measurement activities. So if any of you are interested in sharing your data collection outcomes, tools, performance plan, measurement plans, whatever you think would be of interest to the group, we'd love to hear about them. So please let me know if you'd like to present. Are there any questions on any of these new webinars or on the conference? Hearing and seeing none. If you're shy and you don't want to speak up, you can also type your questions into the chat box. Or if for some reason you're listening just on your computer speakers, feel free to use the chat box. All right, let's move on to our really exciting webinar for today. I'm very excited about this. The topic for today's call is volunteer respite, putting the pieces together from implementation to recruitment and matching. I know that many of you are already very engaged in stimulating new volunteer respite opportunities under your Lifespan Respite grants. But I have heard from some of you, though, that the community and faith-based organizations you work with to implement these initiatives sometimes struggle with volunteer recruitment and retention, or they're challenged by meaningful relationships between volunteers and families, or even getting family caregivers to accept volunteers. And then, of course, I know everyone is concerned about sustainability of these efforts. So we thought it would be very helpful to provide some guidance to you as leaders in your state respite coalitions or as the Lifespan Respite grantee on how you can provide successful ongoing training and technical assistance to your community partners who are implementing these volunteer respite initiatives so that you can ensure that all aspects of a successful volunteer respite program are in place beyond just the training of respite volunteers. And we're so lucky to have in our own network an expert on volunteer respite who herself volunteered to do this webinar for us today. So not only is she expert at running volunteer programs, she's expert at volunteering. But Mary Jo has experience not only as a community-based respite provider who ran her very own very successful and nationally recognized volunteer respite program for close to 20 years, but also as the statewide training and TA coordinator for a state-funded volunteer respite initiative called Take 5 that was an outgrowth of the Pennsylvania Lifespan Respite Grant a few years back. So she's going to talk a little bit about that initiative and how it spawned numerous volunteer respite programs across the state for children with special medical needs. And Mary Jo is also a founder of the Pennsylvania Respite Coalition way back in 1998, and she's still very active in the Alliance for Respite Care in Western Pennsylvania. So thank you so much, Mary Jo, for your willingness to talk to us today, and I am going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jill. And today really is a conversation about respite and volunteer respite. If you're familiar with our webinar platform, I'm going to encourage you to use the chat box off to your right-hand side whenever you have a question or if I pose a question to you. If you're interested in the materials and the slides from today's webinar, they're in the materials box, and all you need to do is download those files. So that information will be there for you in addition to the recording. So we're going to focus really today on a statewide respite initiative and what we learned from it. I think sometimes walking into this type of work, people think that the main focus needs to be on training volunteers, and that's where we throw a lot of our energy. And while that's very important, that's a resource that's relatively accessible to many of us. But the pieces that lead up to it, the pre-contemplation, assisting organizations to consider what type of respite they're going to provide with their volunteers, the actual implementation, keeping some sort of fidelity to a process that is broad enough to engage a lot of groups, but yet specific enough to keep volunteers and family members safe is also important, as well as the retention of the volunteers. So that what you're doing is really adding and building on a program and not having to recycle and replace every so many months. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that program and what it was based on, and the type of training and technical assistance that we provided statewide, and then the types of outcome accountability that we looked for. And as always, you can type a question in at any time, during our conversation, but we'll also give a few moments for questions at the end. So in Pennsylvania, our Volunteer Respite Initiative was for faith-based and community organizations. And the goal and the idea behind that was to develop or expand programs. So we knew that there were some faith organizations, some community centers, YMCAs, that were doing something that they might want to expand upon. We also knew that there were other organizations that wanted to do something but perhaps needed some support or didn't know the language. They knew that they wanted to help families, that they wanted to engage their volunteers, but maybe even the phrase respite was less than familiar to them. So our goal was to identify those organizations and to really work with them. So within that, we had a really strong outlook, a very focused outlook on engaging YMCAs, YWCAs, community centers, faith organizations, and grassroots groups. And the thought behind that was that human service organizations have had a number of years to help address the unmet respite need. And in our state, they were able to do it with very limited success. Yet these faith and community organizations have been around for hundreds of years. We worked with a church that had initially started in 1863 and a YMCA that opened in 1912. So we knew that these organizations not only had longevity, but they were also trusted in their communities. And that meant for us that they could be trusted by both the potential volunteers who were coming and looking for a volunteer opportunity, as well as families who were looking for someone to provide them with some support. So our initial large-scale replication didn't just happen overnight. It really was based on a couple of different things. And the first one was way back in 2010, our state did a needs assessment that was a collaborative effort using some United Way data, some kids count data, some information from our Department of Public Welfare, our Department of Health, and our Office on Developmental Disabilities. And throughout all of that, respite care came up within the top 5 of the needs. So we knew that it was a priority among our family caregivers, and it should be a priority amongst our funders. We then, around 2011, kicked off our Lifespan Respite grant, where we formed a Lifespan Respite Advisory Council, and that council provided some evaluation of respite efforts and some recommendations. And during our Lifespan Respite grant, we were able to provide some vouchers and do some outcome accountability and really, do some evaluation of the effectiveness of those vouchers, and we found that the vouchers were good. It gave people the funding to access respite, but it didn't necessarily provide them with respite in the sense of we didn't have nearly enough providers to meet the need, and that many of our families had said money wasn't the hugest barrier. It was finding that trusting and caring person that they felt comfortable leaving their family member with. And many of them had indicated that those relationships were relationships they had within their community. So even though we allowed with our voucher program for families to pay for neighbors or extended family members and things like that to provide care, there was still a large interest on the side of both families as well as the community to really start to explore this volunteer piece a little bit more deeply. So later then, as our Lifespan Respite grant was wrapping up with those recommendations, the state decided to access a Title V block grant, which gave them some funding specifically because our largest unmet need at that moment was really children with complex health care needs. And that block grant allowed us to create a request for applications that allowed for 25 communities across the state to develop volunteer respite programs within faith or community organizations. So as you can see, it was a 4 to 5 year process where we went from really exploring with community members to trying some different activities to really then focusing in on some things that we thought would more greatly meet the need. So our focus, again, was to increase the availability of respite for family caregivers through trained volunteers, but it was also knowing that trained volunteers were not going to be enough, that we had to provide some sort of training, support, and funding to these programs, and both immediately and then provide them with ongoing training and technical assistance. So using the chat box off to your right where it says Q&A, I'd like you to take a moment now and just type in, if you would, what are some of your greatest concerns, or where do you have to put the most effort, or what are some areas of assistance that you would think that your programs need around developing and sustaining volunteer respite efforts. So I want you to think about either the programs that you are working with or fund or are considering funding, and just type in the chat box what some of their greatest training and technical assistance needs might be. And I'll give a few moments because I see some folks are typing. So liability concerns, and that is something that we hear a lot, securing some funding to help offset costs. Obviously, we use volunteers not because they're free, but because their time is freely given. But obviously, it does take some funding and support in order to make that accessible. Accessibility to train providers for children, background checks, and resources. So you can keep typing, and these are some of the things that we are going to cover today. And there is always the case of there are families who are feeling as though the person who's coming in to provide care is not as adept as the family caregiver, regardless of the amount of training. And, to a degree, there's some truth to that. Family caregivers, we often see them as the expert in the care, and we can talk about how we can work on engaging those families to feel more comfortable, whether it's a volunteer or paid person. So who is involved in Pennsylvania's volunteer respite effort? And it is the effort that we, for the purpose of this funding, called Take 5. We had a pretty strong statewide infrastructure, our Department of Health, our University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, and then several other partners. And every state has a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. It's a federally funded program that channels into a university that has a statewide reach. And it was very important for our Department of Health to engage with somebody who had their feet on the ground and had a statewide presence. And our USED was just that entity. They not only were known across the state, but they had access to assisting and engaging families. They were able to support the training and technical assistance. And then equally as important, they were able to support the outcome accountability and the evaluation process. So that became a very important partner for us in terms of our success. And then we knew that we needed the reach of other partners, such as someone to provide the volunteer training and someone to assist us in engaging some of these faith organizations and community organizations and grassroots groups. And the USED is the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. So again, you can just Google, USED, and you can look at the site and you can check on, click on your state, and it will tell you what university is the identified USED site for your state. In Pennsylvania, it's Temple University's Institute on Disabilities. So that became one of our partners, as well as a number of our other community partners. And then obviously we needed the faith and community organization buy-in. We needed to identify those organizations that wanted to create or expand a volunteer respite program. And in doing that, it seemed like a lot of outreach. We had to find those gatekeepers. For any of you that have ever been involved in person-centered planning, you know the term gatekeeper in terms of the individual or organization that is most likely to introduce you to others, and others will trust you because you came from that gatekeeper. So we needed to find those gatekeepers. It literally came down to finding some of those publications in communities that list every faith organization and doing outreach to each and every one of them through letters and emails and personal meetings. There was a lot of coffee and a lot of sitting down and having conversations about what would best fit these organizations. We also knew that there was not going to be any one formula that made an organization more successful. And even looking back on it, our data showed that. We worked with churches that had as few as 20 members that were enormously successful because they were rooted in the community and known to the community. And then we had some of our larger faith organizations that had over 7,000 people, members. And again, the size of the organization did not always indicate success. So we didn't just put our focus in larger organizations with an expectation that, those organizations would be able to recruit more volunteers. We also met organizations where they were at. So if organizations said, we only want to recruit volunteers to serve the unmet needs of our faith community, we permitted them to do that. We permitted the definition of community to be whatever that organization saw. So if it was a YMCA and they wanted to initially focus on current members, we allowed them to do that. If they saw the community as the geographic environment where they were located, we allowed them to do that because we knew that it was very important to not come in and prescribe too many things because that would be a deterrent in order, for them to get the program up and running and actually sustain it when we stepped back. We also allowed the faith and community organizations to apply to the university, to our USED, for Take 5 grant resources. And when I say that, it was a very small amount of money. It was $5,000 for their year. And that $5,000 could go towards any non-equipment type of thing. So if they needed money for snacks to have during the respite, or if they needed money to pay for printing or marketing materials, or a very small amount to offset a volunteer recruiter's salary, they could do that. They had to provide a budget, but they were in control of those funds, and we let them direct them to what would help them the most. Some of our organizations had wonderful ways of getting CPR training or, getting space or having snacks, peanut-free snacks donated or gluten-free cookies. So we weren't going to require them to use it for something that they did not necessarily need. We also made it very easy for those organizations to apply for the funds because we realized we had been within the human service umbrella for years, and we had been using jargon, and we had been, writing grants and applying for funds. But these organizations historically did not have that area of subject matter expertise. So we wanted to make it as comfortable and easy as possible. We also needed to engage families. In this case, it was the families diagnosed with developmental or chronic health issues. And we wanted to make sure that we were, while we were engaging the community organizations equally, we were doing some marketing to families to let them know that this was an opportunity that was coming their way. And then the volunteers. We require our volunteers to be at least 18 years of age, in part because we felt more comfortable with the level of care that they could provide to the child, the amount of clearances that we could do, background checks, and then overall their ability to get to families, whether it be in rural communities or at a center-based respite. And all of the volunteers had to be trained through this process to provide respite care. And we did not do the training. We empowered the organizations to do it. So what did it look like then? Well, it was our Department of Health who accessed some funds through Title V. It was getting Temple University's University Center for Excellence in Disabilities. It was getting a provider, which was the Watson Institute, to provide guidance around implementation and volunteer training. And then with the whole idea of recruiting and training the organizations. So we, as the statewide entity, we never laid hands on the volunteers. We never did outreach to the families. We empowered the organizations and provided our training and technical assistance to them to do it. And then it was reaching out to all of those organizations in order to get a group of volunteers to identify the families, ultimately with the idea of providing respite care. So within the successful framework, the first thing that stood out for all of our organizations and in retrospect that made it successful was using the Arch Volunteer Respite Manual. That manual provided not only a guidance for our state to establish its volunteer respite initiative, but it also provided a guide for all of our community organizations and then everyone that they touched. And that guide going from, the very beginnings of pre-contemplation of looking for what type of respite program that, an organization might want to ideally provide, all the way through sample forms became just a wonderful resource. And we used this guide at every step of our implementation. We used it in order to create our request for funding. We used it as a way to think about the organizations that we were working with. We used it with the organizations to assist them in identifying what the needs were in their community and how they were going to meet them. And then we used it to assist in the training and then the maintaining of their volunteers as well as the sustaining of their program. So I can't say enough, Jill, about this volunteer respite manual, and I know the PDF is still available. We downloaded it for everyone as we went, so we ensured that everybody had a copy of it that we downloaded, and then everybody had a link to it. The next thing that made the effort statewide a success was the training and technical assistance, that we weren't just putting the funds out there and that we weren't just a one and done, that we were engaging people with, again, a very small amount of money. But it was interesting to note that money was not the issue in the end, that people were able to be, these organizations were able to be incredibly creative with that $5,000, oftentimes using it as leverage to get other funds from some of our other foundations. And then the ongoing training and technical assistance to ensure that organizations were staying the course as well as getting the support that they needed. So that small little, it literally felt like I was giving them a little change purse in order to get their organizations up and running. But they did a wonderful job with it. In thinking about the volunteer manual, Arch's manual, it assisted us in working with the faith organizations and community groups who really needed to explain why they were utilizing volunteers. especially to individuals who said, well, if those children and adults have such incredible needs, shouldn't somebody be paid to take care of them? Or, gee, isn't there already something out there? That volunteer manual literally was able to give information from, the types of volunteering, the benefits of volunteering, and rather than us recreating the wheel, we were, again, able to take that manual and take it into our implementation work and say things like, turn pages to pages 7 and 8 and refer to the benefits of volunteering. Or likewise, turn to the page, and look at what's the benefits of the family and community. And by doing that, it became not any one of us just directing the conversation, but it really became about something bigger. That respite wasn't about, if you have somebody with a disability or special health care need, of course you're more sensitive. It became more that this was a community issue. This was a public health issue, that it could be any one of us at any time. It could be our neighbor. It could be anyone who needs support. And, there's a reason to reach out and engage through this volunteer effort. And then the next thing we looked at is ensuring that all of our programs were given materials and activities that were evidence-based or evidence-informed. And I know that can be somewhat of a scary word when we think about evidence-based, evidence-informed. What do we mean by that? But what we were really looking at for our effort was something that had demonstrated effectiveness. And if it wasn't research-backed in terms of years, although we were able to do that with the Take 5 effort to use a volunteer program that had a strong evidence base, that at least it was evidence-informed, that we had anecdotal data from the community about what worked in their community, and we were able to support some volunteer development that not only kept people safe, but also matched what was the expectation of the participants. So God bless you. So as an example, some of our faith communities were really clear that they would never put volunteers in homes and that they would be doing center-based volunteering. But what worked best for their participants is if they did some sort of theme, like a movie night or a craft night. They couldn't just call it a respite drop-off. It had to have some sort of focus to it. And literally, the one pastor, what he would do about an hour before the respite event is he'd go door to door to the families. It was a walking community where he knew that they had individuals who might benefit from that type of care in order to get them to come down. And it was hard. It was hard for him to engage families. So instead of respite at the beginning, he actually did family nights where the families came and brought their family member, and the volunteers were also there. And he developed the trust between the volunteers and the families to the point where then the families finally felt comfortable enough to leave their loved one, and he no longer had to go door to door in the hours leading up to the respite event in order to encourage them to participate. So again, evidence-informed, it can be that anecdotal piece, what you're hearing back from families in focus groups, or anecdotal data from people on the street when having conversations, all the way to evidence-based and doing some activities or functions that have demonstrated some effectiveness with the population that you're also intending to work with. So we took all of that and worked with the organizations, and we really realized it needed to be a two-pronged approach. Part one was really implementation. How do they even develop or enhance a respite program? Because again, these were organizations who were not necessarily familiar with the human service or the aging or the child welfare aspect of doing things. These were organizations who were great at doing what they do, right? They were great at being YMCAs or faith communities or parent groups. They definitely demonstrated an interest in respite care, but they needed support. We knew that they couldn't just train volunteers and set them off to do their work and just expect them to turn in hours and call it a respite program. So we spent a lot of time on implementation and probably not as much time on how to train their volunteers as much as how to recruit them, how to sustain them, and then how to put some closure on the relationship. So part one we did on one day, and then when we could, gave individuals a couple of weeks to go back to their organization and really work with the implementation information. And then we brought them back to think about how to get those volunteers, how to support them, and how to maintain them, with the idea that after that second day in person, that there'd be that ongoing training and technical assistance. So we really stuck with them. So given day one, our focus really was giving them a framework or a model to go off of that was flexible enough to meet their community and needs, but also met some basic benchmarks or requirements, taught them how to plan for the respite program, and shared with them some core components. And core components really are those things where it doesn't matter the age of the person that you're providing respite to or their disability. It really is some standards that across the table would be the same for all of us. Keeping people safe, ensuring that people are trained. How those things play out may look different from program to program. In fact, it may look different from a community organization, from a grassroots parents group, to a faith organization. But the core component itself will be there. So we established some overarching core components that I'll share with you for the purpose of Take 5. And then we actually specified some things, and some of them related to the needs in Pennsylvania that are requirements for keeping children safe and then ensuring that there would not be issues of liability. So part of that then is to ensure that we are developing confidence and competence within the programs with their volunteers, because we knew that with an increased confidence and competence, there would be a decrease in liability issues. And then again, the marketing, the helping people keep their program running, the sustainability, keeping people open to training and technical support, and helping them evaluate. So we had master trainers who went across our state and helped with that implementation piece. And literally, it really was conversations and really helping people develop a toolkit of resources. And again, that toolkit included not only the information we were sharing with them specific to Pennsylvania and specific to the population, but it was also that volunteer respite manual. We literally used it as our navigation guide. And I encouraged people to not just take it back and put it on their shelf, but really to take it back and you almost use it as a GPS. You know, if they were concerned whether or not they were still on course, they could jump to that part of the manual. If they were looking at future destinations, they could look at that part of the manual. And during that time, we also helped our programs explore the type of volunteer respite model that they wanted to provide, whether it was within their center itself or in a home or somewhere out in the community, not necessarily in their center or family home, and whether they wanted to do it, let's say, once or twice a month, or maybe for special events when they had speakers or dinners or activities, or if they wanted to do something that was much more regular and planned with families. And again, some of our faith and community groups hadn't thought that through to the point of they knew they wanted to do something, and then realizing that clarifying the type of respite model that they were going to provide and the frequency and dose would help them engage volunteers and also help families sign up for the program. So I mentioned to you about core components or some type of standard, and the core components are vital to what we saw as Pennsylvania's success. And in retrospect, there's probably not a way that I would engage in any effort like this without having some core components. And so what we did as the state provider, our partnership between the Department of Health and the University Center for Excellence and our training partners was to sit down and identify what were those things that were absolutely vital to have shared with these programs and ensure that all of the programs had operating, regardless of whether they were faith or community or grassroots. So these were standards that we required our organizations to have in place. We would support them to put it in place. We didn't expect them to come to the door with it. They would help these programs define what they were doing as a part of their respite, so it really helped them articulate the types of activities that they were doing. We also defined them as elements that could be observed or measured or demonstrated. So I could come in and I would know, or I could find in a file or ask a question or observe if these things were taking place. And then we provided them with ongoing training and technical assistance to implement them. So we didn't just put it out and tell them they had to do it. We put it out, we discussed it, we looked at how they could implement them within their organizations, and then we provided them with, up to 18 months of follow-up to ensure that they were able to do it. So this is what they look like, and there were 6 of them. And the first one, obviously, is volunteer recruitment, right? And the benchmark was they had to have recruitment strategies that were realistic. And they talked about not only the benefits of volunteering, but also some of the challenges. And we wanted to ensure that whatever they did with volunteer recruitment employed person-first language, that they were ensuring that they were describing individuals with disabilities, not the disability first, and that they were, ideally going out and able to do, what we've all practiced as an elevator pitch. And that's one of the ways that we address this core component even in our implementation days, is to have folks sit down and really think about what is your elevator pitch for how you would engage a volunteer. You're at a volunteer recruitment fair or a speed dating, which is a thing that's very popular in public libraries, where they do speed dating for volunteer events, and you're standing there looking to recruit respite volunteers, but the person next to you is recruiting, somebody to come and wrap Christmas gifts and do a holiday item, which seems, sort of time limited and exciting, and the person on the other side of you is recruiting people to walk with cute puppies. And all of a sudden, you're trying to explain the challenges of providing support to a family caregiver, and how do you do that? So we wanted to ensure that people had experience and had a volunteer recruitment strategy, ideally in writing, written material, written marketing material, or something that they could use that was in person-first language that could recruit volunteers. And then volunteer screening, right? That the benchmarks for us is that all of our programs had to have an application. They had to agree to the minimum commitment for volunteering, whether it was 6 months or 1 episode or 1 year, whatever the program required. And again, as you can see, we didn't set those requirements for the programs. We asked the faith and community organizations to establish those themselves. But we just let them know that that was something that they needed to consider and do as a benchmark in order to meet that expectation. So we didn't require every volunteer program to keep their volunteers for 1 year. We required them to have a time frame and to be able to articulate that through as a part of their screening process. And we also required the programs to conduct an interview, to check references, and complete a comprehensive background check. And for us, at that point, and in part, we were able to capitalize on some of the things that were happening within our state that allowed for free volunteer screening. Part of the settlement with the situation that we had with the sexual assault at Penn State were to ensure that every volunteer had background screening, and then our governor made all of those screenings free of charge. So that was clearly a benefit for us. But what we also said is, with each of these benchmarks, there could be enhancements. So you could choose to do more than what the governor required. You could not choose to do less. So, and that's the same for any benchmark. So some of our faith organizations are required to provide and practice safe sanctuary, where a child was not allowed to be alone with an individual adult, and the 2 adults, if there were 2 adults with a child, they could not be related. It could not be husband and wife or brother and sister or any type of familial relationship. That's an enhancement to this benchmark. The YMCAs did not require that. Some of our grassroots groups did not require it. We encourage that if your organization had an enhancement that went above and beyond the benchmark, that you should do that. You were not limited by these benchmarks. These benchmarks were only meant to be the baseline. And what we found in terms of liability then is many of our organizations found that when they went back and talked to their liability provider, they had far fewer issues as long as they were meeting core components and or exceeding them with enhancements. So when we prescribed the benchmarks, that's why we gave some time with this two-prong approach. We needed the organizations to go back and sit down with their organizations, their liability insurance providers, and talk about then, were they meeting the bare minimum with these benchmarks, or were there other enhancements that they were required to provide? Our third standard was volunteer training. We required our programs to do a minimum of 4 hours of in-person training. We came up with that number based on some data that we had gotten from the National Mentoring Organization, mentor.org, and some of the studies that they have done, that 4 hours of in-person training seemed to be what individuals needed in order to increase their confidence and competence. Now, with that in mind, we didn't require that they were 4 consecutive hours, because if it was an organization that said, you know, I can't get people to sit in here for a whole Saturday afternoon, that was fine. Well, what about 2 hours on consecutive Wednesdays or something else? We again, put out the benchmark, put out the baseline, and then allow the organizations to customize it in the way that seemed to make the most sense. And then likewise, we provided them with evidence-based materials provided by CareBreak's curriculum, which was our evidence-based program. They could take that material and customize it to whatever they needed. So as an example, we require the programs to do person-first language, right, and to share examples or help the potential volunteers understand more about the individuals that they will be serving. Well, for some of our community groups, for that portion, they would have a parent or a family caregiver come in and speak to that issue. For some of our faith-based organizations, they chose to read something out of the Bible and to discuss that and to talk about how identifying with someone's need was a way to increase their spirituality. For other folks, it was doing it in a different way. So as you can see, we set the benchmark, but we didn't prescribe exactly how the organizations needed to do it. And then the family outreach and enrollment, and we've touched on it briefly, but it really was about assisting families to develop a comfort level in leaving their family member, even if it meant for those first few times to do it more as an open house or a family event. But we also identified later that the families were far more comfortable with organizations that they had history with. So if it was their faith organization or their YMCA, and it was funny, one of our YMCAs was doing a program, and it was an activity-based program for kids with autism, and they had said, we don't know what to do because the parents aren't leaving. They're sitting up in this one area where there was glass windows where you could watch and look down at the gymnasiums, and they're just sitting up there watching the activity. We don't know what to do. It doesn't feel like they're getting a break. So they held a focus group with the families to say, what would you ideally like to do at this time, or what would make you feel more comfortable? And some of the families said, having coffee available in that room, because they were finding that they were increasing their protective factors, they were increasing their social support just by being with those other families. So it was providing some light snacks. And some of the other families said, well, what they wanted to do is maybe work out during that time. So the YMCA started to provide guest vouchers for working out every time the families brought their kids in for the respite. And what they found eventually is families moved from the break room to the workout room and eventually out into the community. So it wasn't an immediate drop-off piece, but they really built the trust of the families. They listened to the families, and they provided some responsible solutions. And then the monitoring and support, and this is the retention piece. Sometimes, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, people feel that engaging, the volunteer and training them is the hardest part, but what you really want to do is retain that volunteer and help those programs retain their volunteers. So it's providing them, those organizations, with resources and support that they can share with their volunteers. It's providing, those organizations with ways to think about recognizing or networking, and again, not prescribing it, right? So we ask that all of our organizations at least once a year recognize their volunteers. It could be through the organization's newsletter. It could be during Volunteer Recognition Week in April of every year by sending out a thank you note. One of our organizations had the families write the thank you notes for the volunteers and then just, disseminated them, and we got amazing feedback from those organizations that the volunteers were just so thrilled to have that type of recognition from the families. It could be for our faith-based organizations. It was sometimes standing up during a service and recognizing the efforts of volunteers. So we didn't, again, prescribe a way to do it, but we encouraged people to be very thoughtful about how they did it. And we knew that just like we were cultivating and providing ongoing training and technical assistance to the organizations, likewise, they needed to cultivate those relationships with their volunteers and provide training and technical assistance. And we also encourage them to take volunteers, recruit from the places where they felt most comfortable first. It might seem easiest to go to a nearby university and recruit a bunch of college students, but if you don't have a relationship with that university, or you're doing a program where that constant turnover might be a challenge, that might not be the best place to start. That might be a place to eventually build in your volunteers. So we worked with them around sustaining their program by identifying some strategies that would work best for their organization. And then as well as to collect some data. And again, we're talking about organizations that didn't historically collect data in the ways that we collect data. So we had to give them some relatively easy-to-use tools. And then we had to give them ways of tracking it. So I see one of the questions was, do the volunteers receive certificates after the 4 hours of training? And yes, all of our volunteers got a certificate that acknowledged that they received the training. Our volunteers, due to the nature of the work with children with complex health care needs, we required our programs to have either someone CPR certified or to offer CPR certification to all of their volunteers. And that those certifications needed to be retrained or recertified, on the basis of whenever they needed to occur. In addition, our clearances in Pennsylvania are good for 36 months. So people needed to get recertified or rechecked with their background checks every 36 months. And although we did not require the organizations to retrain their volunteers, we did have them provide some type of in-servicing or some sort of networking opportunities, just for ongoing education, continued learning, things like that. But it's also a great way to recognize volunteers. If you're bringing people together and maybe you have a guest speaker that talks about supporting individuals with challenging behavior and you're offering some light snacks, it's a great way to build fellowship. It's a great way to build retention. So the whole retraining or ongoing training was not so much about necessarily needing more information as much as building on the confidence and competence of the volunteers so that the organizations weren't consistently going out and retraining and re-recruiting. We also encourage them to think about recruitment and sort of getting volunteers in through the door as a year-round activity, that if they were only depending on fall for college students and then again in the spring, they were missing large windows of opportunity of folks. And if they were training for something specific, like a summer Bible program that was going to be inclusive of individuals with all needs, that they needed to, set their timeline effectively so that they weren't training college students who were going home in May for a program that wasn't starting until June. And then the final benchmark that we talked about with the programs, which is not something people talk about a lot, but it's very important, and that's closure. What to do when people need to move on. So students finish their college career and they move back home, or they move home for the summer, or a child passes away, or an elderly person passes away, or people move on, or people just don't want the service anymore, or they're not happy with the service. So there could be those unanticipated match closures. So we wanted to give each of those programs the opportunity to identify some strategies. We obviously shared strategies with them based on some of the evidence that we had. And part of it was being very clear and upfront, having volunteer policies, having family policies. All of those we got or could share samples from the ARCH Volunteer Respite Manual. So these were not things that we needed to totally create within ourselves. We gave each organization samples of those as well as the manual, but we also permitted them to develop some themselves. And then looking at ways to get some feedback to measure the impact of the volunteer caregiving relationship between the family and volunteer that went beyond satisfaction. Because we knew that if you asked families if they were satisfied, you might hear yes, even if the answer was no. And in part, that's because families have had to struggle for so long with so little that sometimes having something that is not good enough is better than nothing. And then other times they don't want to rock the boat. And so we wanted to ensure that what we were looking for, which was a meaningful experience for the volunteer, but also a meaningful use of time and decrease in stress for the family caregiver while their family member was also positively engaged in an activity, was taking place. And so we knew that in saying goodbye to people, even in the best of relationships, we encouraged our programs to get some feedback from those participants using some sort of surveying technique. So when you put it all together, this is what it looked like. Teaching our organizations to recruit volunteers, starting within first, because those were the people that knew the organization best, and expanding the reach to whatever they defined as their community, to volunteer screening, ensuring that you were meeting the benchmark of the state-sponsored effort, as well as the bare minimum for your organization. So they couldn't go lower than our benchmark, but they could always go higher if their organization had greater requirements, and then running that through their insurance provider to look at liability. And we knew that if we addressed it up front, and this demonstrated it in the 25 programs that we worked with across the state, we did not in the end have a single organization who had a problem with liability because they addressed it up front as a part of their pre-contemplation and implementation. So they didn't just come in with a set, this is what we're going to do. We're going to send volunteers into homes. They're going to be unsupervised, but they're going to be trained. They sat down and said, these are the things that we're looking at. This is the type of training we can provide our volunteers. This is the background checks. What more do we need to do to ensure that volunteers are safe, family members are safe, and the individuals receiving the respite are safe? And within that, the organizations and their liability providers were able to come to a common ground. Obviously, training the volunteers, and then the family outreach and enrollment, being creative, engaging people where they're at, using families to engage other families, just like in family resource centers and any other types of services. The best recruitment tool is word of mouth. We're all pretty good at doing the Facebook posts and the Twitter posts and social media feeds and posters and things like that, but there was nothing better than those families who could give testimony to what the program meant to them. And then, getting those 4 components in place was relatively smooth so that we could focus all of our effort on the retention, the monitoring and support, which ensured that we were not only monitoring for the impact of the service and ensuring that those agencies were able to articulate, that what they were doing was making a difference, but we were also monitoring some level of fidelity so that, things were happening in a way that would allow them to be sustainable as well as keeping people safe, and then giving them those closure strategies. So that was their first prong. Again, the day 2, the customizable content for training, that was relatively easy in the sense of many of us have access to either in-person or online or other types of training for volunteers. We really wanted to more spend that time helping the groups think about where they should go and look for their volunteers, how they were articulating it, getting that elevator pitch down, getting their training resources and tools down, and ensuring that they were building up the confidence and competence. And we encouraged them to think about starting in one area and then branching out if they had a community that was not quick to trust, or if they lived in a really sort of robust area where people love to volunteer, to really move beyond. The one thing, again, we didn't do is prescribe, because we knew a number of our faith organizations had specific committees or missions that were focused on certain things, and we didn't want to come in and tell them how they needed to recruit their volunteers to work within their groups. And we also wanted them to ensure that their volunteers really reflected the needs of the people that they were serving. So, a family, somebody coming in and providing respite, we always said should feel like an extended family member or a neighbor or someone that you just feel really good about spending time with. So their recruitment efforts then ideally should match that type of expectation, and that's why it's important in the pre-contemplation and implementation to think it through. And again, we didn't think it through for the groups. We posed the questions that helped them think it through within their own organization. And then beyond training, right? We knew that, again, they could apply those pre-implementation strategies going back to their organization, that they could identify what kind of respite they wanted to do and prepare their volunteers, but retaining them in a way that would give some good feedback, some good data to document their success is really where we wanted to focus our time. So we really helped them think about what was a successful relationship for respite. What were they looking for? What were they hoping that families would get out of it? And what types of goals were they sharing with families and volunteers? So for some of our programs that we're recruiting from college campuses, the impact was you got to get out of your dorm room. You got to be in a family home. You got to spend time, doing some things, sort of stretching out and playing games that you couldn't always do in a dorm that was loud and crazy and cramped. For the kids, it was an opportunity to build a relationship with another caring adult who didn't care if they played the same board game 22 times over, because that young lady would come in fresh every week with 4 hours of her time to give and just ready to go for it. So we were trying to ensure that organizations were setting up clear expectations that could be met with both their families and their volunteers. And then the ongoing support became critical, right? We wanted them to implement their volunteer training and their core components. We wanted them to get some feedback, but we also wanted to provide them with help so that they could in turn provide that assistance to their other folks. So we, as a statewide entity, developed a fidelity checklist with all of those core components. So all 6 of those that I just went through, each of them had a benchmark and requirement, and then we also identified ways to measure them. So with recruitment strategies, the employee person first language, there was a way we could measure it, right? We could look at their materials. We could hear their elevator pitch. We could read their volunteer job description, which we required them to have and gave them samples from the Arch Volunteer Respite Manual. We could see completed interest or tracking activities. We could see that their volunteers that they were getting were 18 years of age. and that they at least demonstrated an interest in fulfilling the tasks. So these were not, this fidelity checklist was not a hand-slapping compliance tool. It was something that we as a state utilized to help the local faith and community organizations be successful. And this wasn't something we handed to them and told them to fill it out. It was a conversation guide. I sent it out ahead of time, but we did site visits with all of our programs, and we sat down and had conversations. And not so much of, do you have this, but is this something that you can show me? Well, if not, how can we help you? So it really became, again, not a compliance issue, but a training and technical assistance issue. In the same way that ARCH provides training and technical assistance to all of us, I don't think any of us has felt that Jill has come to us, with some sense of, we're in compliance or out of compliance. It's more, how can we help be successful? The feedback from our faith and community organizations overwhelmingly was this fidelity checklist developed off of the core components help them stay the course, help them bring other people on within their organization, and help them be successful, not just successful in their program, but being successful in asking for help. Because for so many of the program participants, this was such a new territory for them that it was almost like some of us who aren't good at math having to take calculus. And when the professor would say, does anybody have any questions? Well, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And this fidelity checklist was able to prompt them to ask for things like, hey, do you know anybody who has some marketing material about vacation Bible schools that they would be willing to share, because that's how we want to expand our respite? Or, hey, do you know anybody who has some resources on training their volunteers around, looking for sexual abuse or the Darkness to Light curriculum? And that became not only then for the programs to stay the course, but as for us as the statewide TA providers, it allowed us to think about what did we need to do in terms of peer sharing to help increase the knowledge of the organizations so that they could increase the confidence and competence of their volunteers. So our training and technical assistance ongoing went from recruitment strategies, helping them customize some training content, troubleshooting, sometimes disability-specific resources, related to individuals with mobility issues or behavioral supports. Peer-to-peer sharing became vital. Pennsylvania is a really big state. We divided it up into 6 regions that were our 6 Department of Health regions. And in addition to the 2 days of in-person technical assistance they got at the beginning, the ongoing site visits, which were about once every quarter or so, they got some peer-to-peer sharing opportunities twice a year where they could get together in person with some of the other faith and community organizations, and we would bring in a speaker or someone based on their needs, and then give them the opportunity to do the bring, brag, and borrow, right? Bring an idea that you're feeling really good about, brag about it, borrow an idea from someone else. That peer-to-peer sharing ended up being one of their favorite activities throughout the course of the multi-year project that we engaged in. And then that further supported them to do the data collection and evaluation. And then if they identified other areas, we were pretty excited to help support them to do that. So in the end, we as the statewide entity really wanted to focus on evaluating effectiveness, and we evaluated it in a couple of ways, and that was the faith and community organizations. We had an increase in the ones committed to respite, and we did. We had 25 organizations who either expanded or started a respite program. The number of screened and trained volunteer respite providers were increased, which overall then meant that the amount of respite received by families was much higher. And so what we found with this effort is it made a difference, right? The organizations were able to log 720,000 volunteer hours throughout the course of the Take 5 effort that we monitored. And I say that we monitored because after a couple of years, these entities were so ingrained within their organizations, they didn't need support from us. It really was just a piece of what they did, and we collected that data for the course of our funding. We were able to estimate that it was $14.63, which was the value of 1 hour of respite in Pennsylvania, and we determined that by the labor and industry cost equivalent for a home health aide, somebody who could do some light support or provide a meal, but not necessarily give medication or do some other things. Even though some of our faith organizations and community groups had a nurse on site who would dispense medication, we didn't assume that that was that way for everyone, so we went essentially for one of the lower to middle of the road denominators, which was the home health aide. And with that in mind, the value of the volunteer respite provided over a 2.5-year period of time was $10.5 million. Our volunteers definitely made an impact through these 25 organizations, and we also, collected some anecdotal data, and got some comments from the volunteers, the family members, as well as the impact that it had. So we knew that this could be seen as somewhat of the satisfaction piece, that qualitative piece, but you put it together with the quantitative, and it really does make a difference. So I'm just going to pause here now, and now take some time for your questions or thoughts, and you can feel free to type it in to the chat box, or you can unmute yourself, and you can just talk a little bit about, I know some people had put in background checks and liability, and if you wanted to maybe ask or say a little bit more about what is it about the background checks that would be a challenge, or what some of the liability issues you're experiencing which might be a challenge. Just take that opportunity now, and again, you can unmute yourself, or you can go ahead and type it in. And while folks are typing, I will ask, does anybody else have a state similar to Pennsylvania where they offer the background checks, the state police, child line, and things like that free of charge for their volunteers? So I see Nebraska has that as well. And again, we really capitalized on that. That really, that was one less thing. When we started the Take 5 initiative, the cost of those clearances was actually $22 per person. And so that was a market savings for each of these faith and community groups where they could use that small $5,000 of seed money to pay for something else.
I believe, this is Jill, I believe the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging also still have a program where they work with a company that will provide significantly reduced background checks if a program's affiliated with the aging agency in the state. And they extended that to us as well a few years ago. So I'm hoping that discount is still available through them. If people are interested, I can find out more about that.
And I see that Mandy also put in another resource through the U.S. Department of Justice. And we also, in Pennsylvania, had a requirement related to fingerprinting, FBI, background check, that if you did not live in the state of Pennsylvania for the past 10 consecutive years, you were also required to get fingerprinted. And then Jennifer asked about the average cost per volunteer of running the program, not factoring in the background check. That really depended on the type of program that individuals were running. So, to screen and train a volunteer to go into a home might be a little bit more expensive, and it could even be around, a total of, and I'm encompassing every cost. If you were doing like a pretty in-depth cost analysis, from staff time to training to monitoring and all of that, could be around $750 per year. But if you think if your retention strategy is good, and for many of us, we've had some experience with volunteer respite programs that their retention was actually really high because they did such a good job of preparing their volunteers and then acknowledging and sustaining their volunteers, that if those volunteers stayed, your costs don't escalate. So, for example, Jill had mentioned early on that I ran a volunteer respite program for 20 years, and our volunteers went into family homes. It took about $750 for us to fully support what we call the frequency and dose of weekly visits for 6 months. But on average, my volunteers stayed 3 to 5 years. So the return on investment for that was relatively high. For center-based volunteering, your costs are going to be somewhat lower. So I would encourage you, if you're thinking about the cost per volunteer and return on investment, is I'm a part of the Friends National Center for Community-Based Child Abuse Prevention, is to go to the Friends website, and we have a cost analysis toolkit, and I'll share my email at the end. And Cassandra Furman and I shared that toolkit at the National Respite Conference in Alabama a little over a year ago, and you can actually go through and plug in your numbers or anticipated numbers, or teach your volunteer programs to do that and teach them how to get the cost per volunteer and look at doing some basic cost analysis and then return on investment. And then someone asked about the average hour of respite the volunteers provide each week, and that really depends on the program. So some of our faith organizations did a every Friday night type of like family night out, and they offered a 4-hour program. Some of our YMCAs were also offering some sort of weekly events. Some of the other ones did more special events, so it might be once a month on a scheduled day. And then we had a few organizations that ran during the school year and didn't offer something during the summer. And then we had a few that did more of like a vacation Bible school program, but they matched volunteers to be with the individuals. And that was 6 hours a day for 6 weeks in the summer. And that was based on a community needs assessment. That was something that those families said that they needed, and those families didn't have access to extended school year. So that's really going to depend on the ability of the organization. You know, we talk a lot in that implementation training about the need of the community, which is very important to understand exactly what the need is, and then the capacity of the organization, because it really isn't, oh, you build it and they will come, because sometimes you can build it and then you'll be sitting there alone. And an example I can give is my respite program started out in a hospital-based setting, and the way that hospitals do volunteer recruitment is that they would have an orientation on the first Tuesday of every month, and whoever showed up could be a potential volunteer in the hospital. So they have automatically assumed that that's what they could do with their respite program. And I can tell you, on the first Tuesday of every month, I was there with a tray of cheese and crackers and some iced tea, and I sat in a room and waited, and no one showed up. And it took me about 3 months and 5 pounds of gaining weight from eating all the crackers and cheese by myself to realize that if I was asking people to volunteer in the community with families that lived in their town, why would they drive all the way to the hospital where this program was located? And I took my recruitment out onto the road and went to local coffee shops and to bookstores, and the next thing I knew, I was able to recruit volunteers. So when we talk about need and that families had need, I just didn't assume that they, would come to me and the volunteers would come to me. We took that needs assessment and then looked at what our capacity was, both in terms of how to provide the service, where to provide the service, and how much service. So it's going to look a little bit different for everybody in every organization, and we really wanted to support the organizations to not take on more than they could do, because then they'd get burned out and feel like respite was not something that they could achieve. And, so we wanted to make it manageable on all aspects. And Mandy also pointed out recognition events can include having elected officials hand out certificates. They have a state representative that's happy to do that each year. And Mandy's absolutely on target. We all love to get recognition for what we do. Those of us who run statewide coalitions, we often ask our governor for a proclamation or our state representative. I think Jill gets a little tired of me hitting her up to do a little video to share at the beginning of our Alliance for Community Respite Care events. But we all love to feel recognized or connected to somebody bigger than ourselves. Encouraging your faith and community organizations to do the same, or giving them that idea, it may be a new resource in their toolbox. So I highly encourage you, sit down and brainstorm those things that you across the state have, found to be successful, and then again impart those on the parts of your faith and community organizations who may not be as familiar, again, with our language, our funding, our style, but they're more than willing to help if you can meet them at least halfway. And there's my contact information. If you have any questions or want to know more, again, you can download the slides over on the materials file where it says Statewide Volunteer Respite Replication. If you just go to friendsnrc.org, you can also look at that cost analysis toolkit that I mentioned earlier if you really wanted to help those organizations look at return on investment and cost analysis, or if you wanted to look at it from a statewide perspective and get a sense. At the end, looking back, all of our perceived concerns around liability, the need for money, and things like that were actually minimized by the organizations. We found that they were used to doing a lot with very few dollars. That $5,000 went a long, long way, and that giving them the information and resources to have those conversations with their liability provider certainly put things in a perspective where people felt a lot more safe. And then in the end, as we did 3 cycles, we did 6 cycles of funding to get the 25 organizations because we did them around, within each region. By the end, we had to turn organizations away. We didn't even have the capacity to, support all of the faith and community groups to do the work. And we even had some university groups come forward from some of our smaller universities who were very invested within their communities. So what we ended up doing in the end as we took a step back from our effort is we asked those 25 funded and trained organizations if any of them would be interested in becoming master trainers of other faith and community groups within their area. And we had enough across the state that we were able to support those groups to sort of pay it forward, and they in turn have worked with some of their peers. So YMCAs are working with YMCAs. Faith organizations like the Lutheran Synod is working with other Lutheran churches within their organization. So we were able to ourselves model sustainability by ensuring that those organizations could not only do the work, but they could help support other groups to do the work as well. So Jill, that's all I have for you today. I think I'm at the end of my time, unless you have any questions or final thoughts.
Mary Jo, I can't thank you enough for a really incredible presentation, as always. We are so lucky to have Mary Jo as a resident expert in our network. And for those of you who have not met her, if you're able to come to our national conference in May in New York, Mary Jo always has a significant presence there. So you'll have an opportunity to meet her at that time. I did want to let people know that she did mention the volunteer manual several times. We do have some hard copies still available, and we're trying to also figure out how we might update it. I think the basic core information in there is still incredibly useful, but we do need to update some of the links to volunteer examples and to links to some of the resources outside of ARCH that we refer to. So we're working on trying to get that manual updated as well. So thank you again so much, Mary Jo. I do want to remind all of you to please respond to an email that you'll receive right after the webinar asking you to give us some feedback about this webinar and to give us suggestions for future topics. As always, we really value all of your input and hope that you'll take just a minute to open that email and respond. So thank you very much, Mary Jo, and we will be talking to you all on the next call. So look out for those emails from me about dates and times. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.